Hvala lijepa poštovani ministre, a sada mi je posebno zadovoljstvo predstaviti nam našeg sljedećeg panelista, ministra vanjskih poslova Kraljevine Švedske, gospodina Carla Bildta. Gospodine ministre, izvolite.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this invitation to the Croatia summit. I think I've been here during, I think, virtually all of them. And as we've seen the summits evolve, we've also seen the region evolve, and we've seen the evolution also of the European Union. I think we are now in a period when there is a certain amount of, let's call it, soul-searching in virtually all important international organizations, trying to cope with a world that is developing very rapidly, but perhaps somewhat differently from what we thought. Starting perhaps briefly with the United Nations, where we are supposed to be able to solve the most pressing issues of our age by a process where you need to reach consensus among nearly 200 nations. In Copenhagen in December of last year, when trying to address the climate issue, we found that that wasn't really a very operational way of working, but we haven't yet found the answer to how to proceed on issues like climate change, global trade negotiation in a world that is becoming far more multipolar. The OSCE, without going too much into Mark's domains, of course embraces the vision of security and cooperation for all of the wider Europe, stretching all the way to the borders with China. And here we do face challenges that really need to be addressed in a somewhat more serious manner. 2 summers ago, a lot of people were taken by surprise by the 5 days of war between Russia and Georgia. And those 5 days of war left the legacy of Russian occupation of part of Georgian territory. Clearly, this was a war that should have been averted, and could have been averted, in my opinion, had our policies been somewhat more alert to the realities of that region and the realities of certain other power trends than we were at the time. Now we see the remaining frozen conflict over Transnistria, and indeed Transnistria might become the new and the real litmus test on whether there is a true reset of Russia's policies, not only towards the far abroad, that's somewhat easier done, but also towards the near abroad, and that's where the real reset is necessary. We also see a build-up of tension between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh, and that's another of these frozen conflicts that must not be neglected in the same way as we failed in the past. And of course we have been confronted during the last weeks with ethnic violence, ethnic dispersions, perhaps ethnic cleansings in the very volatile area of the Fergana Valley in the Central Asian region. The number of deaths and the number of displaced during only days of conflict there were higher than the number of deaths and the number of displaced in the Kosovo conflict prior to the NATO intervention in March of 1999. And what happened in the Fergana Valley is very clearly linked to the wider challenges we face. It is linked to what we see happening in Afghanistan, because it's the same mix of ethnic volatility and organized criminality and the drug routes. Indeed, we see the warnings that the drug routes coming out of Afghanistan risk creating a perfect storm of conflicts, of tensions, of criminality, of erosion of state sovereignty in rather wide area. Fergana might be something that will bring further troubles if we are not prepared to act. NATO is, of course, in its own soul-searching with the strategic review. At the same time, is it struggling with the Afghanistan mission, our common mission, the by far largest in the history of the organization, the by far most challenging of peace and state-building operations that the international community has engaged itself in for a very long time to come. This comes at the same time as we know that our electorates demand quick results, instant solutions, which is not possible, neither in the Balkans nor in Central Asia, not to speak about the borderlands between Central Asia and South Asia. And it also comes at the same time as we know that the imperative of deficit reduction in a number of key countries is going to result in a reduction in defense expenditure in a number of the key countries necessary for the upholding of the strategically so important mission in Afghanistan. The European Union, for its part, is in a rather, as always, a rather difficult situation. I'm saying as always because Europe really moves forward by being confronted with the one challenge after the other. There is seldom a blueprint for how we should deal with each individual challenge, and the way in which we deal with them does create the blueprint of European integration in itself. Headlines have been dominated by the crisis handling of the euro area. Primarily, the Greek crisis, and the gravity of that should certainly not be underestimated, but it should not be neglected either that we did manage the Latvian crisis, we did manage the Irish crisis. There are a number of crises coming out of the near-death experience of the global financial markets that we did manage. The Greek crisis might be more severe in a number of ways, but it is under management. But this is exposed to a new north-south divide in economic management, economic development, and economic governance in Europe that needs to be addressed, primarily, of course, by addressing the reform deficit that we see in a number of European economies, not only in the south, but primarily in the south. Although the headlines, as said, have been dominated by the immediate crisis, the European Union has been focusing on the long-term challenges. EU 2020 in terms of economic governance has a 10-year perspective. The reflection group under Prime Minister González that reported, hardly anyone noticed, a couple of months ago, had a perspective 2030, that is a 20-year perspective on the challenges that we face. There is little doubt, in my opinion, that the economic challenge is the key challenge that we face in Europe in the next few years. Success or failure in addressing the economic reform deficit will define success or failure in how we are perceived as an economic and social model in the years ahead. And how we are perceived as an economic and social model in the years ahead will determine whether we have the magnetism, the so-called soft power, that gives us influence also in the wider periphery and in the wider world. So while we see the headlines in the financial pages on deficit reductions, we should not underestimate the security implications of success or failure in that if we look at it in a 5 or 10 or 15-year perspective. Our soft power is at stake in our economic management. And where we to fail, what would happen if we lose the soft power is that we will see our periphery drifting away in other directions, doing their own things, tensions in the adjacent areas building up, and a radical decline in the global clout of the Union. I don't think that this will happen, but I do think it's important to be aware of the consequences where we to fail in handling the economic reform deficit that we have. We live, as I said, in a rapidly changing world. We have behind us the struggles to get the Lisbon Treaty in place. We are still working with the institutional setup, not least on the external side, the External Action Service. I guess Robert Cooper will say something about that. We had a High Representative proposal in March. We had the Council conclusions in April. We had the Parliamentary decision a couple of days ago. But as we then set up the institutions, the institutional hardware, and get that in place, even more important is, of course, to update the political software, the software of policies. Without the software of policies, the hardware of institutions produces just bureaucracy in Brussels, and that is not what is in our prime interest. If you look at the recent economic figures, you get very, very starkly the view of the world that is changing. World Economic Outlook from the IMF 2 days ago, I think, 4.5% global growth, far better than we thought just a couple of months ago. But if you look at how that is divided across the world, the euro area around 1. I mean, US around 3, Northern Europe also 3, by the way. That's the north-south divide. And Southern Europe well below 1 approaching 0 or below 0. Emerging economies around 7, China 11, India 9, Indonesia 6. It's an acceleration of the trends that we have seen for some time. And let me just then quote what the reflection group under Prime Minister González had to say, and I very much share that assessment. We are now at a fundamental choice. This could mark the beginning of a new phase for the EU, and the next 50 years could be about Europe's role as an assertive global actor, based on economic success, based on enlargement, based on regional responsibilities. Or alternatively, the Union and its member states could slide into marginalization, becoming an increasingly irrelevant Western Peninsula of the Asian continent. That, I think, is the challenge we face. And as said, the way to handle it is address the economic reform deficit, have a new strategic consensus on our regional responsibilities, of which enlargement is the single most important. The Western Balkans, our relationship with Turkey is absolutely critical in this respect, but it goes also wider, as I illustrated with the Fergana Valley and the frozen conflict challenges. And then, of course, on that basis, we will be seen as a credible, as an impressive, and as an important global actor, and then we can move with the wider agenda. But first, I think we must get the wider European house in somewhat better order. Thank you.